In this lecture, we're going to keep talking about the African American experience in the South during Reconstruction. But we're also going to start moving into what happens after Reconstruction ends in 1877 and begin discussing the events that take place during the Jim Crow era in Southern history, well, American history for that matter. And we're going to talk about how the African American community adapts and adopts to segregation. We will hit on the labor system in the South. We're going to hit on African Americans developing their own separate communities. And we're also going to talk about segregation and how that impacted people, African Americans especially, during the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Remember, segregation goes on forever, or not forever, but it goes on for quite some time, seemingly forever for many people. Segregation doesn't really end in the South legally anyway until we get to the 1950s and the 1960s. So we have decades upon decades in front of us after 1877 where segregation is kind of the law of the land in the southern part of the United States, literally. And what happened? How did black people respond to that is the question. And so we're going to look at that from about 1877 or so until the first decade of the 1900s. And then we'll pick it back up later on whenever we talk about the civil rights movement after World War II. So that's what our lecture is going to be about in this presentation. We're going to talk about how African Americans began to build communities after the Civil War ended, during Reconstruction, and then also during the Jim Crow era. We're going to talk about the labor system in place in the South, especially the issue of sharecropping. And we're also going to talk about segregation, how segregation came to be, and then how that impacted society in the southern part of the country for decades. So as we begin the story of the Jim Crow era and the African American experience during Jim Crow, you can't really talk about what's going to happen in the late 19th and early 20th century without talking about the end of Reconstruction. And essentially, Reconstruction ends basically with what's called the Compromise of 1877. And essentially what that is, and I don't want to get too deep in the details here, but what happens is that there's a presidential election in 1876. A man named Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, and Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate, these two guys are running for office. And once the election's over and the votes have been counted, there's a discrepancy. Some of the states didn't have the correct count, or some of the ballots have been disputed. And so both sides, both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, are contesting the election about who won. And it's going to go on for a little while. And eventually what happens is that the Republicans go to the Democrats in Washington, D.C. and say this. And they say, listen, if you let Hayes win, if you agree that he's the victor and let him take office as president, what we're going to do in return is remove the federal presence of soldiers and administrators from the South. Now, this is important for Democrats, right? Because most Democrats are based in the South, especially Southern Democrats who are out of power because of the new political structure that's taken place since the end of the Civil War. And so, of course, they're going to be very, very keen on the idea of having the federal presence leave from the South and allowing them to maybe take over as time progresses, which is exactly what happens. Because the Democrats are going to agree to this idea and let Rutherford B. Hayes take office. And in return, Hayes orders the federal presence out of the South. And once those soldiers leave, soldiers who had been helping to maintain the peace between African-American community and the white community in southern states, well, then all of a sudden now African-Americans are on their own. And because of the intimidation by the Klan and those other terrorist organizations during Reconstruction, the African-American voting presence is not what it could be. And so what we see is because of the intimidation against voting, African Americans are going to lose political power. And as that happens, they lose the controls to politics. They're also going to start losing controls to those efforts to become equal socially and economically as well. Those men who had been in power before the Civil War, the white upper class especially, are going to reclaim power during the last few years of Reconstruction, and as we get into the Jim Crow era, what is also called the New South era sometimes in American history. And so now we have a new political or a new hierarchy, a social hierarchy, a political hierarchy, where the old guard, the old white elites are now back in power. And it's in this new world African Americans find themselves after 1877. And it's in this new world where Jim Crow will begin to form. Now, as we begin to see the traditional white political elite regain their power after 1877, and really in the years leading up to 1877, thanks to the intimidation used by the Klan and other groups to keep black people away from voting in the voting booth, what we begin to see next is that these people back in power now want to ensure they remain in power moving forward. We had lost it. We've gotten it back. Now, how do we keep it moving into the next century of the South? So that becomes an issue. Maintaining political power by the white establishment, maintaining economic superiority, and ensuring that we have access as landowners to our labor supply. Remember, the South is an agricultural-based economy, right? So they need labor to till the land. And so that has traditionally been slaves, but now we have free slaves who are going to need to keep working for us. But we want to ensure that we maintain and retain our economic leverage during all of this. And also, we want to make sure that as the white population in the South, we have a distinct society that is superior to the black society. So we want to ensure that social standings and social customs remain in place where we're on top and the African American community is on the bottom. These are the thoughts of these white politicians who have regained power and society in general during this period. So how are we going to do that then? How are the white political leaders going to maintain their power and ensure that African Americans can't reclaim their rights at a certain date, at a later point? I mean, they did have rights after all, right? I mean, the government had given them citizenship, had given them the right to vote. There were civil rights in place designed to protect African Americans and their basic human rights. So how do we limit them then, they asked, in that regard? Well, what we're going to do, they said, is start passing laws at the state level and the local level to ensure that it makes it difficult for African Americans to vote. We're going to pass laws designed to ensure that the two groups stay separate, white and black. We're going to pass laws designed to maintain the system the way it is right now, with us on top and them on the bottom. This is the thought process of the white community, white society in the South as Reconstruction ends and we get into the Jim Crow era. This is the era of segregation. Segregation, and also another term you've heard of before probably, the term disenfranchisement. Now there's a difference between the two. Segregation is basically keeping people apart, in this case races apart, black and white in the South. Disenfranchisement is limiting or completely cutting off the ability of somebody to exercise their rights to vote. All of these things kind of swirl together during this period to ensure white superiority in the South over black society. So that's what we're going to talk about moving forward. By the 1890s and the early 1900s, Southern states have rewritten their state constitutions. Now, if you recall from a previous lecture, state constitutions had been rewritten during radical Reconstruction to ensure that African Americans had the right to vote in Southern states. Each state had to guarantee African Americans in their state the right to vote. Well, now that they have power again, the white elite are going to write constitutions that say something else. This time around, they're going to write constitutions designed to limit the ability of African Americans to vote and to register to vote. And they do it by passing laws that you've heard of before, both at the state and local level, that you've heard of before, like literacy tests, where you had to be able to read a certain passage of something before you could register to vote, which is not going to be great in a society where literacy among African Americans is much higher than whites in the 1870s, 1880s, and so on. The average literacy rate or illiteracy rate for a white person was around 12%. For the African American community, it was around 50%. So right there, that's a way in which to limit the right of African Americans to exercise their right to vote. Poll taxes were another way. Paying a tax in order to be able to register to vote. Easier for those with a job. Easier for those with a savings. Not so easy if you're looking for work. Not so easy if it's hard for you to find work or you're trying to make ends meet in other ways. So this was another way, an economic barrier. What else? The residency rule that some states had that said that you had to live in a certain state or a certain place for a certain amount of time before you could be registered to vote. Now, that's difficult, especially in the economy of the South during the period where a lot of African Americans were on the move, looking for work, going from county to county, farm to farm, land to land, looking for work, not really planting roots. And so if you can't plant roots for a couple of years in order to be able to register to vote, then you can't vote. So these laws were passed designed to keep the black community, black men, because women can't vote yet, remember that, limiting and preventing them from voting. Now, there were ways around this, right? Especially because you have to think that a lot of these rules would apply to poor whites as well, literacy and poll taxes. And how they would get around that was by putting in certain clauses designed to ensure that we can pass laws designed to limit the voting rights of people with less money, but ensure that we have certain clauses in place that allow the white population to get around those rules, the loopholes. You've heard of the grandfather clause before. The grandfather clause was basically a rule that said if you'd been eligible to vote before 1867, if your grandfather rather had been able to vote before 1867, then you too could vote now. Now, before 1867, most people who could vote in the South were white. So right there, the grandfather clause only applies really to white Southerners. The first state to enact these kinds of plans designed to limit the ability of African Americans to vote or register to vote was the state of Mississippi. And it becomes known as the Mississippi Plan. Other states will see what Mississippi did, and they'll try to copy it into their own state constitutions. And finally, by the early 1900s, by 1901, 1902, we have an entire southern area of the country where all the states have basically the same constitution in place that have the same limitations on political freedom for African Americans. And to give you an idea, by 1901, whenever Alabama passes its state constitution, African American voting, registered voters had fallen from about 100,000 in the years prior to under 4,000 by 1901. So this gave the white community the political power it would need to maintain its presence, to maintain its position in the years moving forward. Turning to segregation, segregation was really always in effect in the South to a certain degree. Obviously during slavery and even during Reconstruction, there was this disconnect between both elements of Southern society, black and white. African Americans gained their political rights, their civil rights, and those sorts of rights, but as a social construct, the equality between the two groups was not equal. We could participate politically as African Americans, but we could not necessarily live equally. And so that had always been custom. We talked about the Black Codes before, where African Americans, once the Civil War had ended and the Southern states were still in charge, had passed laws designed to limit the freedoms of African Americans. What happens after Reconstruction is that these Black Codes kind of come back. Only now they're not just customs, they're also laws. And segregation becomes a huge factor in this new custom and these laws. Now, segregation becomes law in 1896 when the Supreme Court decides on Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, if you don't know the background for Plessy versus Ferguson, to give you the short version of it, there's a guy named Homer Plessy in New Orleans, Louisiana, and he decides he's going to try to see what happens if he sits in the white section of a streetcar. Homer Plessy wants to get arrested. He wants to get a court case, and he wants to be able to kind of, argue that segregation is wrong. So he sits in the white section of the streetcar. He's arrested, and it goes to court, and eventually it goes to the Supreme Court. And in the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court says that separate but equal is okay. That two groups, whites and blacks in the South, anywhere really, can have separate things as long as they are of equal standing. There can be a white section and a black section of something as long as it's equal. Now, as we'll come to find out, separate but equal is never truly equal. The white version was always better than the black version. But in law, it was deemed okay to have two different versions of the same thing, one for white people and one for African Americans. And that's going to be the law of the land, passed in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, until 1954, with Brown versus Board of Education. And that law is going to codify segregation in the South. It will be able to cement the separation of both societies from each other in the South moving forward. And it will have lasting repercussions in this part of the world. And really in the North as well, because segregation does take place. It's not the same exactly in terms of law, but it's still there. So it's important to remember that too. We're focused on the South right now, but similar things are taking place in the North as well. But segregation itself, thanks to Plessy versus Ferguson, is going to really, like I said, cement the idea that we have two different worlds in the South, a white world and a black world. And within that, African Americans are going to have to find ways to build their own communities and to exist in a world dominated by white society. One of the main ways to gain power, especially in the 19th century, and especially in the South, which was so dependent upon agriculture for its economy, was that you gained power and you kept power by having land. Land meant everything. Land was money, land was safety, land was legal power. So if you had land, if you owned land, that gave you automatically some clear-cut access to power in certain ways. So land ownership becomes key during this period. And what do ex-slaves, African Americans who are now in the South and no longer slaves, what do they want? Well, they want land. Land is power. And so what you're going to see early on is this scramble to control economic power and to control economic security in the South based upon the idea of land ownership and agriculture. Because the people with the land in the South, for the most part, or who owned large parts of land anyway, were rich white plantation owners who had used slaves during the pre-Civil War period to prosper, to grow cotton, to grow rice and indigo and things like that, and tobacco, to use slave labor to make their money. And now after the Civil War, well, all of a sudden, that slave labor's gone. Who is going to bring in the cotton now in the South to keep me rich as a landowner? And so you have two kind of conflicting issues here. You have freed slaves who want land to live on and to work on, to make money for themselves. And you have a established rich white land ownership that wants to keep making a lot of money but has lost their main workforce. And so what becomes of that is sharecropping. Well, here are African Americans who need land. Here are ex-slave owners, plantation owners with these large tracts of land. So what do? Well, the government, what it could have done, the U.S. government, is redistribute that land that these large plantation owners held. But that seemed very anti-democratic. Even in a part of the country that had gone to war against the North and had been defeated, the idea of taking that land and setting it up and separating it into plots for the newly freed slaves seemed very unconstitutional and undemocratic. So that was kind of pushed to the side, that idea. In its place came the idea of renting the land. And essentially what I mean by renting the land in the South was the idea of sharecropping. So now what you have are the traditional white landowners keeping their land, but offering plots of land to ex-slaves. Come work on my land, bring in my crop, I'll let you live here. We'll sign a contract where if you do a certain amount of work and you harvest a certain amount of goods, we can share in that harvest. That was the idea, the sharecropping idea. If you come to my land and work on my land, at the end of the harvesting season, we'll both share in the profits. That's the idea. But it never really works out like that because there are going to be a lot of different ways in which landowners are going to make sure that the people who come work for them can never get out of that cycle of indebtedness. The contracts are always going to be kind of slanted towards the landowner and against the sharecropper, whether white or black. And a lot of these people are going to be white as well who become sharecroppers in the South. But the problem was that once that cycle starts, there's no way to get out of it. If you owe money to the landowner for seeds or equipment or for housing or whatever, you're never going to make enough money to get out of that debt. Think of it like credit card debt. Once you go into debt for a credit card, you're always going to be constantly paying on that credit card. This is very similar to the idea of sharecropping. You can never get out of that indebtedness and leave. And you couldn't leave anyway because where are you going to go? These guys have all the money. They control the purse strings. So if I cause me problems, I'm going to get fired and I'm going to have nowhere to live. No land, no job, nothing. And I can't really, argue because, again, they control everything. So I can't, I don't want to lose my job, so I must keep myself in this cycle. And so sharecropping, which really begins during Reconstruction, is going to go well beyond that into the 20th century in the South. And it's going to set into place a position or a system, a structure, where certain people, in this case white landowners, are going to have huge economic control over the local black populations in their states and counties and what have you. And it's going to continue for a long time to come. And it's going to cause a lot of issues in the South when it comes to power and land and control. And it's not just about money. This will seep into politics. This will seep into society. So sharecropping really is kind of a center point to the issue of power in the South during this period. In this slide, you see an excerpt from a sharecropping contract from 1867. So take a few minutes to read the excerpt on the side over here to get an idea of what was required of tenants and what they were supposed to do for their landlords as they worked the fields and tried to support their families at the exact same time. This map shows you the density and prevalence of sharecropping in the South during the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the darker the green, the more percentage of farms in that county were actually sharecropping farms. And so you can see that in Georgia and Alabama, you kind of have this string of really dark green running through both states, and in South Carolina and North Carolina as well. This was what was known as the Black Belt of Alabama and Georgia and South Carolina. It was here in the Black Belt where sharecropping really became prevalent during this period and where most of the sharecropping would take place. You also have it in Texas as well and Mississippi, but other than that, it's kind of scattered throughout different parts of states in the South. But sharecropping became very important and very part of everyday life for many African Americans and their white landlords in the Black Belt of the South.